Okay, now before we officially start this conversation, obviously people tuning in can see my Star Wars Episode 1 hat. They can see probably a little bit of the Star Wars shelf here behind me. Obviously, I'm a big fan of this franchise, a fan of this movie from before the last time we talked about it, but I want everybody to know, okay, up front, I'm going to do my best to be as impartial as possible here. Sorry, hold on, a little parched. It's good. I know everybody listening, if they're familiar with our show, they might be a little confused because we've talked about the Phantom Menace already. We did that over a year ago. We talked about the Phantom Menace and the next one, Attack of the Clones, on this show already. But obviously, things have changed since then, including a recent re release of the movie in theaters for its 25th anniversary. Crazy to think 25 years have already passed since the release of that movie in 1999. But this is not the first time that the Phantom Menace has been re-released in theaters. It's happened before, and so before we talk about how it went this time around, Gabe, how did it go last time they tried to do this?
It went so badly. It went so poorly that they actually canceled a whole re-release plan for the entire Skywalker saga. Again, this started in 2012.
Well,
Phantom
yep.
Menace was released in 3D in 2012, pre-Disney buyout. So this is back when there were only 6 of these movies and they were going to release all of them each year with a 3D rendering. And the Phantom Menace was so poorly received that they canceled plans to do the rest of the franchise. And it kind of added fuel to the fire of the fanimosity to the
Ooh.
Phantom Menace, because now people, not only did this movie ruin their childhoods, but it ruined plans for the chance to see Star Wars, all of the classic movies in theaters. Although I'm not sure if I would want to see The Empire Strikes Back in an ugly ass 3D conversion, but understandably, it was just one of those weird decisions. We're going to start with the least popular movie, the least popular section of this franchise, and make people wait a couple years before we get to quote unquote the good ones. But if the Phantom Menace had been received as well back then as it is now in its current re-release, things would have probably gone different, because as I understand it, it's actually doing gangbusters.
It did incredibly. So it was re-released in theaters this year, again, 25th anniversary. It made an additional $14.8 million this weekend, this past weekend at the time of recording at the box office, competing with actual new releases in theaters and adding
Competing
to
with the
its
Fall
total.
Guy, right?
Yeah,
Starring Ryan Reynolds, Ryan
Ryan
Gosling.
Gosling. Yes, other Ryan.
I
And
insisted to myself that I'm not one of those people that will get those two men confused.
what can you do?
But
but
it's such an interesting contrast because it's real doom and gloom for the Fall Guy. It was this 100 million plus budget movie. Ryan Gosling coming off of the biggest movie of last year and an Oscar nomination, rave reviews out of South by Southwest. It looked like
And by all accounts, the trailers were really good. I
the
thought.
trailers were good, although I don't think people trust trailers.
No, I think we're past that, especially if they're horror fans. I know horror trailers have betrayed us too many times. I think, and yeah, I think people are sort of beyond. There's a couple of things that I think are contributing to this. I think there are specific movies that people know they want to go to the theater for. I think that's why a Star Wars re-release of all things did so well coming back to theaters, but so many movies. I mean, even popular series, even Marvel movies that were heading back to theaters, were not doing as well as predicted or as well as they hoped. There's theater experience being a big issue. I mean, I see more people that I know talking about bad theater experiences now than ever. I see a lot of people talking about the fact that they just prefer to watch movies at home. That's not the majority. I know that. I'm part of that majority that does exist that would prefer a good theater experience over a home experience.
But
But it still contributes.
there's that lack of urgency, right? And
Yes.
the fascinating thing is that now it's backwards. So a new movie comes out with all this fanfare. It is a movie that um, demands to be seen in a theater, right? The Fall
Yeah.
Guy, big action extravaganza, but people don't feel the urgency to see it in the theaters because they know it's going to end up on some streaming service, and the comfort of their home is a fine enough substitute for going out spending $30 on tickets and concessions to watch what could be a good movie or what could be a mediocre movie.
Yep.
But the flip of this is that a movie that is as old as we are, the Phantom Menace, it came out in 1999. It's right there on Disney Plus if you want to watch it. But the nostalgia has built up and the affection for that movie has built up so intensely that there is the urgency to see it in the theater now, because it's never been, well, outside of a small window, it hasn't been theatrically available in our lifetimes.
Yeah, and I think something that you touched on there is something that I think would be a good way to sort of begin the transition to talking about our feelings about this as of our recent rewatches. Now, neither of us were able to make it to the theater, unfortunately, to see this re release, so we're not talking about it from that perspective, though we are covering it again from that perspective. So we've seen it since our last episode, and we're here to talk about the contrasting opinions since then, if we have any. But the audience certainly has. I mean, they showed up and they showed out for this movie, and it wasn't just people going to the theaters to see this, and obviously $14.8 million, putting it back in the top 50 all-time box office releases for films is impressive. But what's even more interesting is that almost immediately people, even if they couldn't make it to the theaters, they had a reason to revisit this movie. They had a reason to want to talk about this again, and social media was filled with posts about this movie and discourse about it. Letterboxd, what we use to look at ratings for our show, the movie was at a 2.8 when we covered this for the first time, and it's jumped to a 2.9, which for a smaller movie is not a huge deal, but for a bigger movie with hundreds of thousands of people who've already reviewed it on the site, that's a pretty big deal to jump up, 0.1% on the site. So this movie, we talked about it last time about how there's this growing sort of fandom, and it's not even a cult anymore. I don't think. I think it's really kind of taking over Star Wars fans and even people who may not be like a
Well,
hardcore Star Wars fan.
I would imagine that there's a silent majority of naysayers still, but
Could be.
the the fans and the sympathizers are kind of taking over the discourse in the way that any grassroots movement eventually does, right?
Yeah.
Before you can reach that majority, first you have to really kind of take over the channels of the conversation. And I think
Yeah.
the fans are making themselves heard more than ever. And I've started to see people who still hate the Phantom Menace kind of be defensive or uh, having to react to this upstart of Phantom Menace enthusiasts, and some do it either with some kind of ironic humor. Others do
Yep.
it with true indignation. But the generational divide is what I think is really driving this. Like, these
Yep.
millennials do not get what us Zoomers see in this movie. Just like they don't really get us on anything. They don't know why we're protesting out on college campuses. They don't know why we're going out to see the Phantom Menace of all things in in movie theaters. And so to kind of start that off, do you think the analysis is right that it's a generational divide, or do you think that there are millennials discovering this, reevaluating it? Well, what's your take on that?
So I think as far as people that are throwing praise at it nowadays, other than the people who are already there, like we talked even over a year ago when we talked about this movie for the first time, talking about that group of people who really did love this movie. That's sort of what we alluded to then, was that it was sort of this younger crowd who really wasn't around or wasn't paying attention at the time that the movie came out, to hear all of the people just absolutely destroying it constantly. But I do think that there are two groups of people who are supporting it now, who either really didn't have a reason to feel either which way about it. And now that they're visiting it for the first time or seeing it, again for the first time in years, are finding themselves, not listening to those naysayers anymore. But I do think that there is a large section of Star Wars fans, whether no matter the age, that got caught up in the hatred for the movie and didn't want to like it, and so they went into it not liking it. But now, they're not listening to that anymore. I saw a lot of posts on the app formerly known as Twitter, talking about, like, one in particular stood out to me, and it was this guy who is a lifelong Star Wars fan. I believe he was born in the mid 80s. So he saw Phantom Menace in theaters as a kid, and then he saw it again now. He talked about how much he hated it before. And he said in his tweet, I guess I don't know if they're still called tweets, but I'm going to say that.
They're
Um,
posts now.
he said he was not going to allow anybody to convince him that it was a bad movie anymore, because he wanted to form his own opinion. He went into it watching it for that reason, and there were so many people that agreed with him in the comments of the post. And so it's really cool for me. I do believe that most of the support does come from that generational divide of people who either were too young, like us. I mean, we were one when this movie hit theaters. But there's also, that group of fans that kind of come around and say, you know what, maybe I was unfair to this. Let me give it another shot. And they're surprised when they watch it again and they don't have as many complaints.
Yeah, it makes me wonder what the Phantom Menace of our generation will be. Like a movie that our generation of moviegoers hated, tarred and feathered, tried to banish, and then we watched the next generation, reappraise it and discover it. And I mean, it could be a Michael Bay's Transformers. It could be.
Bo is afraid.
I'm not going to say that the Phantom Menace has more artistic integrity than Beau's Afraid, but let's just leave that conversation off the table. Let's just move on. So I guess we should eventually talk about our feelings
Yeah.
about this movie and maybe how they've changed. But let's start with you, lifelong Star Wars fan, guy who has merch of this movie, which
Yeah.
is something I cannot claim to. As the super fan, has your opinion changed at all since the last time we talked?
It has, yes. My opinion has changed from the last time that we talked about this. Just to let people know, we do want to kind of compare and contrast and see what has changed. So last time I gave this movie an actually great. I was very enthusiastic about giving it an actually great. I will say that it has changed some since then. So we'll see where that lands by the end of this episode. But I want to ask you: has your opinion changed at all since the last time with your rating of a not that bad?
I don't know. I think I don't know how to watch this movie without just studying its relationship to its own legacy. I'm not really watching it for the purposes of enjoying a movie so much, although there are things to enjoy. I
Yeah,
said
right.
that back then, and I'll say that now. But it's just I feel more like an anthropologist dusting something off and studying it. So I think I watch it too clinically. So the first time I watched it, and I think I talked about this experience in our previous discussion. I was taken with it in a kind of so bad it's good way,
Yes.
and I think my opinion has balanced out to more of thinking that this movie is, for lack of a better word, cute. There's something kind of adorable about the Phantom Menace to me. I
Aw.
I think it really is. I just want to pinch its cheeks. Not Jar Jar, not Jar Jar. And there are some kind of gross things about this movie too. But I don't know, man. I think there's something about the sincerity of this movie and of George Lucas's intentions here. I think people psychoanalyze George Lucas a lot, and I'm not sure how much I want to do that. But there's a real kind of kid in a candy store sensibility
Oh
here,
yeah.
but a kid that is weirdly hung up on trade disputes, and federalism. It's it's this kind of like nerdy thing, not nerdy in the Star Wars dress up as, you know, Han Solo or Princess
Right.
Leia, like nerdy, like politically wonky about it. And that I know people have always hated this movie for. I love it. I think it's the most endearing quality of the movie. And I do laugh at it, but I think I laugh in that kind of, I want to pat this movie on the head and say, kid, you've got your heart in the right place. I'll give you that.
Well, and that's the thing too. I mean, that the whole talk about how this movie. I mean, it's been called downright boring for the
Yeah.
politics that they put in it, and it's like, for me, I've always just seen it as something that's essential to the plot of Star Wars. I mean, this is literally the movie that is going to be the kickoff point for the entire rest of the franchise, including three movies that we've already seen at the time of release. Right, like we've already seen. If audiences are going into the Phantom Menace in 1999, I would say 99% of them have seen Star Wars, have seen The Empire Strikes Back, and have seen Return of the Jedi. And so not only are you now going to set up this story arc to play off over three films, but we've already seen how it plays out in the next three films. So they had a tall task here. I don't quite see it from the same perspective. I do think it's kind of funny that you kind of changed the corner on that and have turned it into a more admiration, I guess, than anything.
Admiration,
Um,
adoration.
yeah,
Uh, it's
sympathy.
oh, I'm
Question
very
mark.
okay. Let me label myself this way. I'm totally a Phantom Menace sympathizer. I'm not an
Right.
apologist,
No,
right?
okay.
But I'm a sympathizer. I think, okay, so you're making a prequel trilogy to a movie that's famously this metaphor for the the battles against fascism and
Right.
imperialism, in the 19th and 20th century. It's a loose metaphor. It's not a perfect analog, and it's not very
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
textual, but it's there. And George Lucas has always been very open about taking inspiration from Vietnam, for example.
Right.
So he's making a prequel trilogy about that, and obviously, what you have to do if you're really going to tell the origins of this battle is to make the story of the Weimar Republic, right? And that might be too history school for some people, but I'd argue history school kind of ethos has been at the heart of these stories. Now, maybe we're telling the part of the story that not everybody thinks is quite as dramatic, but if you're really interested in the mission of the original trilogy, I totally think it was definitely an interesting idea to go back and tell the origins of this. The whole Plinkett review idea of these movies are useless. Why did they make them? I don't need to see this. Maybe you don't, but I think it provides a very interesting context. I mean, execution is kind of a different story, which we can really dive into. But I've always been in that school of camp, and I think I've planted myself more firmly that no, this movie had every right to exist, and it had every right to focus as much as it does on the political fabric of this universe, and not just the lightsabers and the dogfights in space, or the spectacle stuff.
Yeah, and in regards to like the whole political scene of the movie and all the things that happen with it, there's something that really kind of captured me this time. I think every time I watch this, there's something different that really captures me. And the last few times, I've been fully admitted that it's the nostalgia factor of it, right? And it's the whole fact of that this is the only Star Wars movie to come out in the 1990s. This is the kickoff point. This is one of the first movies I remember loving as a kid. So, there's a nostalgia factor, but this time specifically, and the last time that I watched this as well, I'm just captured at how well I think they executed the idea of Palpatine being like the most evil motherfucker of all time. Like this guy uses his political knowledge and where he's kind of wormed himself into at the time we come into the story, which is as a senator. He uses that position to manipulate a 14-year-old queen to vote against the acting chancellor, to worm his way into another spot of political power. And of course, with that move, he sort of orchestrates the defeat of his own attack to gain the trust of everybody after he's just been named chancellor. So it's such a cool and gripping thing to just see, like, you sometimes you think like, this guy is so clearly evil. He's got an evil voice. He's got an evil face. Like, how did this guy come to power? And seeing it, like, the last few times I've watched this, just kind of watching how he just pulls the strings of everything from the first film all the way through to the third one. I think this is the perfect way to kind of set up how this guy wormed his way into power. And he's not in the movie much as Senator Palpatine, but he's there just enough for you to know that he is behind everything that's going on, even the defeat of his own droid army that he pushed to attack Naboo. It just shows you how calculated it is, and I think that's a really well thought out part of the story that I don't think gets enough credit when you watch this movie. Probably because people are paying, too close attention to Jar Jar Binks and lightsabers, but
Yeah, it's a pretty subtle element of this movie. It doesn't feel very pronounced until you watch it in the context of this whole prequel trilogy, and then you get to really
right,
see how these seeds were planted, and see how all of these movies tied together through that
yeah,
through line.
exactly.
Here's a fun way to talk about this movie, though, that I think is even more poignant now than when we last talked, right? So everybody talks about movies today as having a political agenda.
Yeah,
Go woke, go broke. The recent Star Wars movies and TV shows are accused of just that.
yeah.
It's very interesting to me that nobody's ever really accused the Phantom Menace of having an agenda, of being woke. I know it came out before that that really was coined, or that's
Right.
how we started
Yeah.
talking about these matters. So let's just sit on that. Is this movie woke? Would it, if it were released today, would it be considered woke? And if it's not woke, why? Because it's way more interested in pressing a political um, philosophy, or at the least, making audiences think about politics, way more than what the sequel trilogy did.
So I'm gonna say no because of a couple of reasons. And it's not my personal definition of what I couldn't give a shit what people call a movie. If the movie's good, the movie's good. Uh, my issue, I think, when comparing this to the new movies, which people would categorize as woke, like you said, or overly political in some ways, is I think it's the awkwardness at which you fit those themes into your story, I think, can be a big indicator of whether or not people are going to call it overly political or woke. I think when you look at this movie, they fit it into a. I think it's still loose enough compared to what's going on in the world at the time that this was released, as compared to some of the new movies, that you really could see how somebody would watch this and go, maybe watch this, and let's say they watch this and then they go watch The Last Jedi. I could see how they'd watch The Last Jedi and be like, that movie's over political and this one's not. If they're already making that argument, the awkwardness at which it's fit into the new movies is, I think, what makes it stand out to people. Whereas this one is technically more of a movie based on politics and it's more political. Um, I don't think people pay enough attention to it to make it so. Like, at the end of the day, it's all about perception. I again couldn't give a shit what's woke, what's not. Just give me a good movie and don't make anything feel forced. And I don't think anything does feel all that forced in this. I think everything fits within the context of the movie. Everything seems to have a purpose in what they're talking about.
Well, at
Whereas,
the
like,
time, people obviously did think that this felt forced. That's kind of been, people say the first sign of trouble, the first red flag of this movie is the fact that the opening scrawl is talking about, again, trade disputes,
right.
uh, federal negotiations, taxation disputes.
So I want to run back on something I said a moment ago, because I think if this movie had been released today ahead of the release of the next two movies, I do think that they would probably say something like that. I
Mhm.
think if we had the full context of 1 through 3, I don't think that they would. I don't think that they would say that same thing. I think in 1999, and I think even a little bit afterwards, anybody who hates the movie is going to find any reason to hate it, and we know that from experience on the show. Just seeing people talk about things about movies that just don't matter. or wouldn't matter to most of us. But I do think if this movie had no context of if this movie was just Star Wars Episode 1 and that's where we were starting, I do think that people would say that it was overly political. But I do think looking back on it, I think it fits perfectly within the context. And if people still want to say that it's forced, that's totally fine. I just don't see, yeah, I don't see it that way. I see it as a good way to, put this man into power. Um, maybe you have a boring start to that. I don't know. I didn't think it was too boring.
Well, it's more puzzling than boring. Just the fact that, again, the context has been removed, and I think that's why the Phantom Menace kind of goes down easier for people now. But just
Yeah.
imagine waiting this
Oh no,
long for
yeah.
a Star Wars movie,
Yes.
and you hear the title, The Phantom Menace, and you think, what are they gonna fight? An army of ghosts? What's gonna happen? It must be crazy because it took so long to make. And again, the first scroll is just the FCC regulations are
I
being
totally get
challenged.
it. I get it. I mean, like, I think there's enough of this movie that like one thing that I thought was interesting watching our old episode back was the discussion of whether or not some of the people in that initial we talked about some of the initial news coverage coming out of the theaters for Star Wars and how many people were like, "Oh, that was awesome." And how much of that just felt like people that were sort of desperate to justify their years of anticipation and the money they spent to go to the theater and the time they spent waiting in line and all of the things that went into it because a lot went into the release of this movie. A lot. um, and looking back on it, like I think that there is some of that there, but I do think that there's enough in this movie that even, I think if you're going into it as a non-Star Wars fan, I could totally see being disappointed if somebody were to tell you like about Darth Maul, for example, and then you start the movie, boarding a trade ship talking about negotiations. I think some people would be disappointed. But I do sort of want to push back on my own people on that. And that, like, what are you expecting from the first chapter of a trilogy? Yeah, I think I
Well,
get
when you
it.
compare it to the explosive beginning of A New Hope.
And I get it, and I totally get it. I do think this movie could have potentially benefited from it's not an issue for me, but I can say that it probably would have benefited from us getting into the aggression from the Trade Federation a little quicker, maybe starting with them on the ship. I know that sounds like you're cutting out like 5 or 10 minutes, but that's a
Or
big
maybe
difference.
maybe just come up with a fancy sci-fi jargoning word for trade, you know like maybe just come up with a different word for that. Like if it were not the Trade Federation, but the Tremungo Clofungo, right? And then
Well, at this
Star Wars fans would have that tattoo,
Clomungo,
Tremungo
Tremungo,
Clofungo.
Clofungo.
Yeah,
I got it on my back actually.
they would cosplay as these guys for for
Well, I
conventions
mean,
and stuff.
then we'd have more reasons to clown on George Lucas. I mean, people already laugh about what is that character that the internet created for him? I think it's like Blup Shido, of like that's how George Lucas names his characters. Like, we'd have more of a reason if he was like, oh well, the word for trade in Star Wars is Tremungo Clofungo. Which, by the way, as a George Lucas fan, that's not too far off of something he would come up with.
I mean,
He's done some
people have
crazy
been
shit.
clowning on his writing for a very, very, very long time.
I mean,
It's a proud
infamously,
tradition of that
yeah.
community, right? I mean,
Not even just the community, actors. I mean,
actors. Harrison Ford, Han Solo himself said, "You
Mark
can write
Hamill.
this shit, but you can't say it."
Mark Hamill said something about it. Alec Guinness said something about it in
He
interviews.
said
I
a
mean,
lot of things about it, man.
at first he was very complimentary until that's all people talked about his career, and then that made him a little upset.
But that's kind of actually how I feel about this movie. I think the way people kind of affectionately, take these jabs at George Lucas, and
Yeah.
I think it's widely understood that he has deep flaws as a director, right? But you take it in stride. It's George Lucas. No, he can't direct actors, but that's not that's not why we have George Lucas around. Like,
Right.
if you want him to be Elia Kazan, well, first off, that would make him a dirty rat. But second, it just wouldn't capture the imagination of people the way that it did. So I take most of the problems with this movie in stride. I was trying to think of legitimate criticisms I have that actually bother me, because I have criticisms that don't bother me, right? But
Right.
criticisms that really do stick out. And obviously the main one is still Jar Jar. He never really gets easier to watch. It never becomes any less tragic, the fact that he's in this movie as much as he is.
Misa's so sorry about that.
Well, you say, explain yourself, man. Like, are you a Jar Jar Binks apologist? Where does Jar Jar sit with you?
Um, so Jar Jar is a tough one for me because as a kid, obviously, like, a lot of kids like Jar Jar Binks. I have a friend who I infamously shamed during my Star Wars prequel hater years for Jar Jar being her favorite part of the movie. Um, and by the way, she was like well old enough where that shouldn't have been the case. So yeah, I'm a little
You feel
justified there.
vindicated there?
Just a little bit, but I do roll back on a lot of that now because here's the thing: like there's definitely a nostalgia factor that I feel about Jar Jar, but there's also this sense of like sort of the way that you look at this movie is kind of the way I look at the attempt with Jar Jar Binks, right? Is like you're creating this Star Wars for a new generation, right? You're bringing it to a new group of people, and you have to do something. You have to do something enough that people recognize it as Star Wars, but you have to do enough new things that they don't think you're rehashing it. I think we saw a lot of trouble with that with the sequels, in that they didn't kind of understand that the same way that I think the prequels did. Prequels were different enough to not be the same exact experience that we got in episodes 4, 5, and 6, but they were different enough that they gave you something new, and clearly because they're so divisive compared to those original films. Also, telling the same story over again, but I'm sympathetic to the thought, let's introduce a new character that's for the kids that can sell us some merchandise but also has a purpose in the story. He's not just there to be annoying. They acknowledge him as such in the movie. I mean, they call him annoying in the movie. So it's not, out of the question that adults would, kind of find this guy annoying. But I think the thing that I like about Jar Jar is as both a character within the realm of the story and as an attempt to create something for the kids watching the movie. I think it's a cute attempt. I think
Yeah.
they tried to give him a funny voice. They tried to give him funny mannerisms. They tried to do anything they could to make him a memorable character, but also not waste your time with him.
So here's why I resent Jar Jar. I've been hyping this movie up as C-SPAN in space, which if you know who you are, I mean, that might be something you could be into. The thing is that Jar Jar is so incongruent to that, and it dumbs down a movie that I think is trying to be pretty intellectual, at least for a summer blockbuster. It's a movie that's asking audiences to think about very complicated procedural matters, and the fact that George Lucas's idea of throwing us a bone to make this go down easier, that comes in the form of Jar Jar Binks feels like a borderline insult.
I want to challenge that a little bit. I do believe it was throwing a bone in there, but I don't believe it was for the people like us watching the movie. I think that bone was the space fight. I think that bone was the lightsaber duels, especially the Duel of Fates. I think it was the big conflict at the end of the movie, which is very exciting, by the way. That whole sequence, whether you're watching, Queen Amidala and her people going through, the palace trying to get, trying to take everything back, whether it's the space fight where, Anakin accidentally flies in and takes down the Trade Federation, or whether you're watching the actual duel between, Darth Maul, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Qui-Gon Jinn. That is kind of like a thank you to the audience for sitting through the introduction of a 6 movie story, right? But Jar Jar, I think, was a bone thrown to the kids sitting through this. They're gonna love the action. They're gonna
They
love the
were.
lightsabers.
Yeah, he
But
was.
one thing that's gonna help kids sit through a movie is making them laugh. And Jar Jar made me laugh as a kid. Jar
uh
Jar made me laugh as a kid,
I guess
100%.
we were different kids.
Yeah.
Maybe I was a little bit more erudite as a child. I don't
Well, your
know.
dad was also a film critic, so like you.
That's I mean, I enjoyed kid things. I watched kid shows.
I know.
I
It
sat
was
I,
again. I think there are things that missed about it. I don't. I do think sometimes he goes a little bit too on the annoying side, but like you could see how some of this stuff was a good attempt at trying to make kids laugh. I mean, when he's grabbing all the fruit off the table with his tongue, and Qui-Gon grabs it, and when he gets electrocuted in the face on Anakin's pod
are you
racer.
saying you find that funny or you think kids found that funny?
I think it was a good attempt at making kids laugh, is what I'm saying. I don't currently sit here and laugh at those scenes, but they don't bother me either. It's a part of the experience.
Well, the thing is that we have a child starring in this. This is a movie about a child, about a 10-year-old boy. So, yeah, I think that creates a kind of not an identity crisis. It's not as devastating as that, but that the interesting kind of balancing of, we are making a movie for adults about very serious, mature matters, but, this is a movie for kids. It's about a kid. It's about a kid who's going to grow up to be Darth Vader, but, we're gonna like really lean into this kind of childish whimsy as much as we can, as we're also dealing with the outside world of these socio-political matters, which is a really people will call that a failed experiment, but I think it's an interesting one. I've said the word interesting a couple times.
It's a tough balancing act. I don't know that they always do it appropriately in the movie. I think everything that I look at that could, like, first of all, I want to say this just before I get into this. I have no problems with Jake Lloyd's performance in this movie. I have a big problem with how people treated him following this, along with Jar Jar Binks actor Ahmed Best, I believe is his name,
Who has
uh,
now returned to the
who
franchise.
is now back in Star Wars, and actually is playing a quite a heroic and important character in the context of these new Star Wars stories, which I think is really cool. Um, what I see putting kid Anakin in this, as like a lot of people had that complaint, right? Like Anakin should have been a teenager by this time, and that we should have started with like a teenage Anakin Skywalker, and then he should have been an adult, and then we see how he goes in. A lot of people disagreed with having a kid version of Anakin Skywalker. What I see it as is a couple of things. I mean, first of all, again, like George Lucas has been very transparent about how these movies, like he wants kids to enjoy them. He has gone as far as to say they are for kids. I do think that people have an argument when saying that. Um,
Can you
I
really
think there's
argue this
more.
movie is for kids?
There could be an argument. I think some people would argue that that extra stuff about trade federations and stuff is what's thrown in there for adults' enjoyment. I would say that that's not the case because adults don't enjoy it. Clearly, they don't like the movie. But what I can say is, I think everything outside of the politics of this, right, and the exposition and the sort of story beats that we're getting, I think are thrown in there for both adults and kids. They're just meant to be consumed in different ways. With Jake Lloyd being a kid, Anakin Skywalker, what it gives the audience a chance to do is to connect with a character. I mean, again, they didn't do this. This was their attempt. I did. This is how I watched the movie. For an adult, you're supposed to connect with this kid and feel sympathetic for this kid and begin this sort of connection and watching this kid grow up to be great. He's the hero of the movie. And for a child, the kid's the hero. I mean, what cooler thing could you see than I mean, this
Well, the
kid.
kid's the hero and a genocidal monster in waiting,
Okay,
so
yes, but as a kid,
that's
like,
tricky.
but especially like when this movie is releasing, it's sort of banking on the fact that these kids are introduced to Star Wars in this way, and that everybody from this point forward, George Lucas has said this, his movies are intended to be watched 1 through 6, even though they're released 4 through 6, then 1 through 3. They're meant to be watched Phantom Menace through Return of the Jedi. And so when you watch it in that context, you get to connect with this kid. And I think as a kid watching this movie, they set it up with the
Mhm.
expectation that you're watching this from the beginning. I understand that people don't necessarily agree with that decision, but it gives you a sort of a dual understanding as to why they would do something like this for several things in this movie, how it plays to kids and how it plays to adults. Unfortunately, I think there's just a lot in there that both groups either find uninteresting or boring, especially after the context of waiting so long for another movie. Um, so there's there's a lot there, but I want to ask you, like this time around, did you Jar Jar obviously stayed relatively the same for you. You didn't like Jar Jar then, you don't like Jar Jar now. Did any of the other factors about the movie, like I'll go to Jake Lloyd as an example. Do you have any different feelings about him this time around as opposed to what you had sort of the last time that you watched this? And you weren't angry about Jake Lloyd or anything like that, but just sort of recap how you feel about him when you watch this.
I think that that poor kid. That's all I think when I think of Jake
That poor
Lloyd.
kid, yeah.
That poor kid. So again, it's hard to even judge him as an actor and not just a victim of a
Yeah.
lot of intersecting cultural trends and powers.
I mean, this
But
was more than a response to a bad performance. This was a hate campaign
it was a
against
hate
this child.
campaign against a child who has now been, diagnosed with schizophrenia and just had to deal with bullying and harassment growing up.
Yeah.
So I don't fuck with that, obviously.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even if I thought his performance was as bad as people say. But it's not.
Absolutely.
I actually think it. I mean, I'm gonna use the C word again. It's cute. He's a cute kid.
Yeah.
Was that direction? Was that the direction I wanted to see for the origins of Darth Vader? I mean, that's the bittersweet part, right? I mean, I think Annie is he's a pretty endearing character. I think there's he and Qui-Gon almost have a real relationship, a real dynamic. It could have just used just a little more of a human spark there, but I think the most human connection I get is with their relationship and with Liam Neeson as Qui-Gon especially. I think
Yeah.
on this recent rewatch, he's the thing I continued to appreciate more. So let me kind of like zoom out and look at one of the still lingering complaints about this movie. The acting is boring, the characters are boring. George Lucas doesn't know how to do any of this. He doesn't know how to direct or write characters.
Right.
Um, and there's a lot of evidence for that in this movie. We can get to examples of that later, but there's something that really works about Liam Neeson in this film as Qui-Gon Jinn. He's not a character that people have much affection for. I know they brought him back for a cameo in the Obi-Wan show, but he's just this kind of footnote, I think, in the history of these movies. But there's something about his, he's this Zen bureaucrat, basically, who has a conscience, has a moral compass, but
Yeah.
is very confined and lets himself be confined by regulations and doesn't truly follow his conscience. And that obviously is the catalyst for the tragedy that will unspiral to becoming the Empire and so on. And I think there's something very poignant about Liam Neeson's performance, and it's hard to put into words because he's a very enigmatic character as far as what we know about him.
Right.
But Liam Neeson was the right actor for that character, and I feel like he really captures a lot of depth with very limited, dialogue or anything. I think the moment that really stood out to me this time, it's a small moment, but when Anakin finds out that he's a Jedi, and Liam Neeson says, "Well, how do you know I didn't just kill a Jedi and take his lightsaber?" And Anakin says, "Oh, nobody can kill a Jedi." And Liam Neeson says, "I wish that were true."
Yeah.
I don't know why that moment really stood. I guess because it does contrast with a pretty stoic performance, and obviously foreshadows his death. But let me turn back to you. Do you think Qui-Gon is all I'm hyping him up to be?
Honestly, I would say he's more. Like to be honest, like there's so much to appreciate about Qui-Gon, and first of all, the dialogue conversation about these movies is one you can have about every single Star Wars movie, even up to the new Disney ones. You can have the conversation that the dialogue in all of these movies is not strong. hot take. I think the dialogue in this one's better than Episode 4. You know, the first ever Star Wars. But you know, people don't want to hear that. Um, that said, Qui Gon is the shining example of when George Lucas knows how to write a character, and maybe I'll eat those words when it comes out that someday that he never did, that somebody else wrote that dialogue or revised the script or something. But for now, that's the information we have, and I'm gonna roll with it because George is a fantastic storyteller. You know, no matter what you want to say about his dialogue or about how he directs actors, he's a great storyteller. And the casting of Liam Neeson as Qui Gon Jinn, who ultimately is one of the most important characters in the entire Star Wars universe, if you really boil it down, um, it was absolutely perfect choice. He handled the lines of dialogue, even the ones that weren't as strong, he handled so well with how he portrayed this character that you believed that he meant what he was saying. And he gave us moments of like real levity, and I think he made some changes easier to swallow for me, like even the introduction of the midichlorians, hearing him explain what they were and why they're important made it easier for me to accept, like, okay, they're going to introduce this new thing that we've never heard of. That's cool. You know what, let's roll with it. Let's see how it goes. So there's so much that works about Qui-Gon Jinn, both in the story of Star Wars and in this movie, and Liam Neeson just knocks it out of the park. I would argue that it's probably one of my favorite things about the movie.
Yeah, it's cool to see us on the same page because it's honestly something I just don't even see a conversation about.
I don't
Qui-Gon
know how
and Liam
anybody could
Neeson's
hate
performance.
Qui-Gon.
Nobody hates him, but I've heard people think that he's useless and that Liam Neeson is wasted in the role. And I'm probably I'm not as enthusiastic as you because I still feel like they could have done more with him. But if you are grabbing at a human connection for this movie, I got that from Qui-Gon Jinn. I did not get that from Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi. That is something that actually really stood out to me this time, is, and I've pointed this out before, but it just felt even more true somehow that he just doesn't have anything to do in this movie. And there is an entire section where he's literally taking a back seat. He is just stuck out there on that spaceship while Qui-Gon, Jar Jar, and the Queen go out to, meet Anakin, discover Anakin.
Can I try to defend that for you?
Please, I'm curious to
Okay.
hear what you will say.
So we know Obi-Wan's significance as the story progresses gets more important, right? What I think I like about this one is that they set up the entire time that Qui-Gon is the surrogate father to Anakin. That's what he's going to become, right? He's the first person to really give Anakin real hope that he can get out of there, ends up getting him out of there, puts faith in Anakin when nobody else has faith in him to get them out of the situation that they're in, including his future wife, who has no faith in him at all. um, Qui-Gon's importance to Anakin's progression is so important that when you watch this, it makes sense that what Obi-Wan is not really a factor when this first starts. I mean, you get the sense that if after you watch the movie, if you really think about it, you could get the sense that, oh well, if Qui-Gon stayed alive, Anakin and Obi-Wan would probably be like, he would be like, his surrogate brother. They would have probably that kind of relationship because they're not super far off in age. I mean, they're not. Obi-Wan's supposed to be, I think, a young adult at this point. Um, Anakin, obviously a kid, but they end up having that relationship anyways. What I like about this is that Obi-Wan at that point is sort of forced into a role of stepping up to a place that he should have never been in the first place. And we see that throughout the movie. He's not the one handling all these conflicts. And yes, he's still the learner, but he kind of proves himself to be incapable of it throughout the movie when you really pay attention to what's happening. When you first start the movie, he's focusing on other things. He's not present in the moment, which ends up affecting how they handle things at that point in time. And even though he ends up defeating Darth Maul, that's at a point where he's got to step up. His master just got murdered in front of him. So what I kind of like about this is that we are introduced to Obi-Wan in a way that like this guy is very much still learning. He's very much still behind. You can already see him sort of being trying to balance learning what Qui-Gon is teaching him and realizing it's important with what the Jedi Council really wants him to learn, which is not the same thing that Qui-Gon is teaching him. Um, it just makes sense for me for him to be in the back seat so that he can later fail when trying to, bring up Anakin in the same way he tries to step into a father role when that's something he could have never been. That's something Qui-Gon was supposed to be. Unfortunately, that just didn't come to pass. So maybe if you're just watching this movie alone, I could see you kind of complaining about it, but then you wouldn't have anything to compare him against anyways, because you wouldn't be comparing it against the original trilogy of films. So I think that's the only fair way to look at it, and that's how I look at it in my viewing experience.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
That's how I look at it.
I mean, I hear your viewpoint, and I acknowledge it. I just feel like you're doing a lot of the work here in this analysis of Obi-Wan, more work than the movie's doing in selling me most of these details. So I think I just have to leave it at that. And it's at least a comfort to know that Ewan McGregor really grows into the role. He, I think, becomes almost irreplaceable in the role.
Right. He's certainly more of a highlight later, and I will absolutely agree to that.
Yeah, in Revenge of the Sith. I mean, he's, and he's most people's favorite thing about these prequels, which that was true 25 years ago. It's going to be true for a really long time.
As it should be.
Yeah. But I just don't, I think if he doesn't have the beard, then the magic seems to be lost for whatever reason.
Oh, I can agree with that. I don't think he's nearly as impactful as Obi-Wan in this movie. But I can look past that because of what I see from that. And obviously what I just described plays into why I'm okay with him sort of being on the backseat role in this movie as compared to, the next two.
I just imagine Ewan McGregor reading the script for this for the first time and getting to Tatooine and realizing that he doesn't have a single line for maybe 30 pages.
I mean, he's the one who tests the blood sample.
He does. He's responsible for the midichlorian count, so he gets to have that hanging over his head.
There you go. I mean, all he did was push a button. You can't blame him. Qui-Gon's the one who ultimately, if you think about Star Wars, as great of a character as Qui-Gon is, this is kind of all his fault. He died, first of all. Be better. But second of all, he's the one who got the count tested. He's the one who pushed the council when they vehemently disagreed with training him. And did he have some points in that? I mean, yeah. And would it probably have turned out okay if Qui-Gon survived? Yeah, that's why they call it Duel of the Fates. I mean, you're literally watching them duel over the fate of this child. But it is kind of all his fault.
Yeah, it's definitely his fault that Anakin's mom is still a slave.
Yeah, another essential component of the movie, but something I wish we didn't get because I really like that actress as Shmi Skywalker as well. I know people have complaints about her.
Man, just can you give me a second to process some of these names? Shmi.
At least we didn't get an actual Blup Shido. I mean, we can get. I mean, we don't know what'll happen. I've heard reports about George Lucas returning to Star Wars, but who knows?
What else?
I don't hate the name Shmi Skywalker. I think it's not a great name, but it's not like the worst I've ever heard.
It's the worst I've ever heard.
Max Rebo is probably pretty bad.
Well, okay. That's bad because it's a real name and a boring one with this stupid gibberish that George Lucas comes up with. So that's a different category of bad. But what else can we compare and contrast with, you know, our reactions of the past to right now?
Um, Good question. When I'm looking through this, like I do want to say, like I've been very complimentary about the film. There are a couple of things that did stand out for me a little bit more in the problem category this time around. I think the last few times I've been really nostalgic, and these don't bother me all too much. Like they're not huge issues for me. But first of all, I think introducing Jedi speed was a really, really bad idea because it's never used again. Still to this day, has never been used again, and
And
really
it's
could
a
have come in
terrible effect
handy.
too.
It's one of the points of the movie that I think ages the worst. Um, I think the movie overall, like watching it again, like I do think that a lot of the CG is pretty decent for the time. I think it holds up okay as far as like the context is concerned. Obviously, it doesn't hold a candle to what's happening today, but I don't think it's too bad. But that's a really bad effect, and I mean, it could creates a plot hole for the movie. I mean, why didn't Obi-Wan use that when he was far away from the fight between Qui-Gon and Darth Maul? You could argue it's Obi-Wan's fault then, right? That Qui-Gon died because he didn't use his Jedi speed to catch up. I think it was a really bad idea to throw that in there. Um, and this might be nitpicky to some people, even non-Star Wars fans, but why does the Jedi mind trick work on the leader of an entire species of indigenous people to the land of Naboo, but not on a money-hungry slave owner?
Because George Lucas seems to be a social Darwinist and thinks that there are IQ discrepancies between these races. That would explain some of the unfortunate stereotypes that will always haunt this movie and stain it for me. Thankfully, I think I counted what's his name? Sebulba? No,
Sebulba, you
Watto.
talk.
Watto.
Oh,
Watto.
Watto's the one that owns Anakin and Shmi.
Yeah, he might as well be wearing the Star of David or something like that.
I just hate that credits don't work on me, only money. It's like, oh god, like he's got the nose and everything. It's like, oh, that one has always been the one that stood out to me as terrible. I don't know that the other characters that people complain about have as much of the actual stereotyping other than the accents that really stand out to me. Watto is a shining example of the opposite of that. It's like some Jewish guy made George Lucas mad, so he turned him into Watto. That's what it seems like
And
to
it's
me.
like, where did that come from?
It feels, and that's what kind of bugs me about it is like I can see how people can say that about some of the other characters when it comes to their voices, right? With the Senate, like that's I get it, okay? I get how somebody would be upset about the accent, but at the end of the day, these are aliens, right? So I can see the other side of it where they're like, they're you got to put different accents out there, like maybe they should have spoken another language, but whatever, whatever. Watto is the one that I can never defend. How do you defend that? How do you defend a
I don't know
blatant?
how you defend the trade people either.
Well, it's not like every time they come on camera, there's like a. It's
Does
like they're
there need
just.
to be? Does
They're
there
just.
need to be?
There's just an accent. I mean, they're not using chopsticks or anything. They're just. They have a pretty egregious accent. Okay, but you could defend it. There is a world where there is an innocent reason that they would have those accents. There is a world where Jar Jar's accent is innocent. There is not a world where anything about Watto
Okay,
is innocent.
that's not the world we live in. In this
We don't
world,
know that. What were George Lucas's intentions with putting these characters in there? You
who
talked
knows?
about the
Who knows?
earnestness or the cuteness of this movie.
I
Maybe it
know.
was just an attempt on getting different races and species in the movie. It could
Well,
have been a very innocent reason.
it's an 80-year-old man. It's an octogenarian drawing upon the cinema of his past, which was unfortunately very loose and
Well, he wasn't 80 then.
insensitive. No, but he grew up a long time ago. Okay.
Right. Yes.
So he grew up in an era where this stuff was normalized,
Right.
Asian stereotyping, anti-Semitism. So
Right.
obviously he's not personally racist. I've seen no evidence to that in his personal life. Not that I really know
Right.
much about what he thinks or believes about anything.
Yeah.
But uh the most charitable interpretation is that he is just he's letting the stereotypes of his past kind of into his work, right? Because
You let it leak.
it's a nostalgic project for him, Star Wars. So
Right.
yeah, not that I'm not saying that to excuse him. If you're gonna take out anything from Star Wars in future releases, maybe the nose or maybe change the accents, that could help. That's just a suggestion. It's your movie, George. Actually, it's not. It's owned by Disney, who you called white slave owners. How does that work? Okay. George Lucas is a guy that once I start talking about him, the rabbit hole like really opens up and swallows me because that man is a puzzle.
He's even for me. I mean, who's been a fan of George Lucas. He's one of my biggest inspirations. You know, Star Wars being my favorite, franchise out there. There's a lot I don't understand about the man. Um, and especially, what just got me is like I had this conversation on Twitter or X or whatever. Is like as money hungry as George Lucas and Disney both are and have been for a long time. I get George Lucas wanting to like make new versions of his movie, especially like 97, right? When, like let's get this back into the attention before we release our new ones. Let's like put some CGI in it. Let's make it, real flashy. Like I get that thought process and of course, the money behind it. But I have no clue why there have been no real physical releases of the original cuts of any of these movies. Even the Phantom Menace, which we're talking about right now, I don't have proof of this because I did not go to the theaters and see it. I couldn't make it. We literally had tickets and had to cancel the day before. But I can almost guarantee you that Yoda was CGI and not a puppet like he was in the original Phantom Menace, the original cut. And there were scenes that were cut out from when it was in theaters to when it went on DVD, and these versions were never made available to anybody after they've been changed. As much money as you want to make, why would you not do that? You could milk physical media buyers like crazy if you just released a 4K version of your edits and threw in an extra disc with the original one. Charge an extra $20. I will
Because
pay it.
it's his movie. It's not your movie, you whiny fanboy.
You know what? And like I am not as angry about him saying that as other people. The only thing is like people make your career is built on the connection that people make with your work. And you have every right to go back and change that work. I feel like you don't have a right to deprive people of what they originally connected with though. It's not the same movie.
So that's sort of what I was getting at with the with my question of would this movie be considered woke. I think what I was really trying to get at is this weird revisionism in how George Lucas is perceived by the fan community, because really this man is the reason why we have this discourse about fans versus creators right
Right.
now with Star
Yeah.
Wars. Like this is where the whole chance of listen to the fans, you're you're hurting the fans, right? The battered housewives of Star Wars fandom. That's where that started, was George Lucas and his special editions and his prequel movies. And now the fans who are crying out in agony over whatever state Star Wars is in right now. Listen to the fans. They want George Lucas back. They want him to come up and buy it or take it over. They wish that his sequels had been made instead of the Disney ones. And it's like, honey, you can't get back together with your toxic ex. I know that it's easy to remember all the good times and none of the bad times, but do you remember how he treated you? Do you
So
remember?
I guess let me ask you this question as I believe we talked about this on the last time we talked about these two Star Wars movies. I can't recall for certain, but I want to ask you right now, having revisited this since our last time, as a kind of casual, I'd say you're a more casual fan of Star Wars, not a huge fan of
Oh
it,
yeah,
but
I'm a casual fan of Star
yeah.
Wars.
Would you prefer the Disney approach or the George Lucas approach? If in the perfect world, if you were gonna make the decision, somebody tells you you're the one that's got to make the call. Are you putting it back in George Lucas's hands, or are you keeping it with Disney?
Now,
Let's go back in history to when it was sold. Uh, George asks you, do I sell it or do I keep it? What are you saying?
I I would urge against a sale to Disney, but I would also urge George to pass Star Wars on to a new generation of filmmakers. I mean, he had been bringing people up through Lucasfilm.
Yeah,
Lucasfilm at the time that the prequels were getting fan ire, they were having very successful projects with the Clone Wars,
right.
right? The Clone Wars show and other stuff that I'm not as familiar with, but I know the fans were very happy with a lot of the stuff Lucasfilm was doing at the time. So I wish Star Wars had stayed with Lucasfilm, and I wish George had just become more of a senior statesman and given the reins of power to some new blood.
That's fair. I think that's a fair
The
assessment.
the ironic thing is that he did not want to direct the Phantom Menace. He called every director in town and they politely said no. Even his best friend Steven Spielberg, who said, "I think this is your movie, George," which
Yeah.
is you know that's homie talk for I ain't want nothing to do with this.
Yeah, I
These
mean,
midichlorians, I don't want nothing to do with that.
that's I think that's part of kind of what makes me sad about this movie in retrospect. I mean, Marsha Lucas even said that she felt like crying after watching this because she felt like it was so bad. That's sad to me. Like Marsha Lucas is the savior of Star Wars. I've gone on record in saying that I believe that wholeheartedly. She's the reason that we are all here. Without her, we would have seen the most boring, poorly directed film of all time in the sci-fi genre, and that's saying something. Because I've seen some of the original film of the Star Wars
Oh
movie, and
yes.
it's not good. And that's coming from a lifelong fan. Star Wars has changed my life. I want to say this too. I also would have encouraged probably something similar to you. I don't know that I would have left it in the same hands that Disney's leaving it in now. Who, by the way, like Dave Filoni was one of the people who came up and made a lot of things that fans love and fans are still loving. Um,
Yeah, and John Favreau, right?
and Jon Favreau is another guy who's a lifelong Star Wars fan and has done a good job of kind of putting things together on the television side. I hope they get things together on the film side. But ultimately, if you would have given me a choice, I think it would have been better off in the hand, and not even just for the film purposes. I'm happy that people have connected with the Disney films the same way I connected with the original trilogy first, and then these movies. I'm so happy that people are just enjoying Star Wars, and I would hate for that to be gone from somebody. But at the same time, I can appreciate some of the overly Disneyification of things when appropriate. I think there is a place in this world for a Disney movie. I
Well,
don't know that it's in Star Wars.
let's distinguish between Disney of like classic Disney and
Right.
then the Disney corporation, the Disney conglomerate,
Yeah.
the Disney empire that runs things right now. I mean, a lot of people always compared George Lucas to a young Walt Disney. That's something that makes the state of Star Wars and Disney kind of tragic. Is that it's you know that should have been a match made in heaven, right? And a lot of people had the same thought when the Muppets got sold to Disney. I don't know if you're a big Muppets. I think I remember us talking about this. You're not the biggest Muppets fan, right?
I'm one of those people who's just kind of indifferent. I didn't grow up watching a ton of it, so like it's not something I'm super sentimental about. But like I certainly have an appreciation for it.
Yeah. So as somebody a big Muppets fan, I long for more Muppets content, and I can tell you that when the Muppets got sold to Disney in 2004, Jim Henson had been trying to negotiate that sale at the time of his death, and people thought finally the Muppets are in Disney's hand. Oh my God, let's see what they do with it. And the answer was one really, really great movie, kind of the prototype for what they're doing with all their other soft reboots, right? The Jason Segel Muppets movie, although it's quite good. and then a bit of a disappointing sequel, and then nothing. Right? They tried a season of television on ABC. They've done some specials, and then they did a Disney Plus show, and it's been this weird drought of Muppets content. And this is Disney. Like, what are you doing? Why would you buy this and sit on it? Just because, I don't know, one or two projects kind of didn't turn out the way you expected. Oh, and now I'm turning this into a Disney Muppets expose. But they fired the puppeteer of Kermit. They fired Steve Whitmire, who had been puppeting Kermit after Jim Henson's death. So he had been Kermit's puppeteer for 25 years. And they fired his ass. They canned him.
Disney's decision making over the last, God, it's got to be over a decade at this point, has just been some of the most confusing. Uh, for a company that wants to make as much money as they do, and does they do to their credit. I mean, the Disney parks I think are a genius idea. I think huge revenue earner. I'm not somebody who's just like cold against the business world. Yeah, I'm quite fascinated by it. So like finding ways to give something to the consumer that makes them want to purchase your product. I mean, I got no problem with them doing that, but they're not doing that. Like Star Wars, it took them. They bought Star Wars in what 2000? Wasn't it 2012? Wasn't it right around the time they were releasing these? It was
Yeah.
like it was 2012 when they purchased Star Wars. They released Force Awakens in 2015, and by all accounts at the time, pretty well received. Some people had some problems, some people didn't, but they were just happy to see Star Wars again. And while I think the whole argument that the Disney movies ruin Star Wars, I don't think anything can really ruin Star Wars. I think it's a big enough name and there's enough out there that people love already that there will always be some market for some Star Wars. And the shows are a good indicator of that. But the love for Star Wars didn't pick back up again until those shows. I mean, like, widely. I mean, these movies were widely panned. And it's just sad to me that right now there's not like a concrete here's what's next, right? Like we know some shows that are coming and we have a general idea that there's some movies coming, but we don't know anything about it. Several have been canceled or reworked at already. And I'm sort of disappointed that Lucasfilm didn't get the opportunity to become one of its own big things. Star Wars is such a moneymaker that if George Lucas right now was sitting on what he had with Lucasfilm before and maybe just like even if he wanted to like keep himself as the head of the company but hire like a VP to like run everything non-Star Wars, could you imagine how big Lucasfilm would be? I mean, Lucasfilm did the Indiana Jones movies. Those movies were huge. So it's like they could have been one of these big studios, not alongside Disney, but like they could have worked their way up. And at this point, with George Lucas eventually moving on, or unfortunately one day he will pass like all of us, it would have been in the hands of somebody to try to take it into that next stratosphere. And now it's just another revenue stream. It's just another thing that eventually, if it dries up, it's either going away or they're getting rid of it. They're selling it. That's just sad to see. I don't want to see Star Wars be a shell of itself. And I don't think it is. I think the shows are really breathing life into it. But yeah, this re-release of this movie has kind of made me think a lot about Star Wars since it's happened. And it's made me a little bit more sad to see where Star Wars is. Even if they come out with good stuff, it's just not quite the same.
Well, the audience is there. The
Yeah,
craving for a Star Wars movie in theaters is there,
very much so.
and it has not been supplied to the satisfaction of people. And I
No.
don't know. It's see the Phantom Menace. There are many different types of failures in the world, and the Phantom Menace is the type of failure that will get a second wind and has gotten a second wind, despite all the odds. And I just don't think Disney failures are the same. I think they're too um, utilitarian in purpose, right? They're designed for a major box office weekend. They're designed to be a tie-in to the million other projects they have going on, right? So they just don't have a shelf life. I mean, the Rise of Skywalker, uh, I understand that there are some fans of the movie. I just can't really envision that having the box office gross on a re-release that the Phantom Menace decided. But hey, that might be what people said about the Phantom Menace, and they've been proven wrong. So standards are going to continue to change. I will say, and I've been hesitant to bring this up. I'm a little scared of what this says about the culture that a movie that used to be considered kind of bottom of the barrel 25 years ago is compared to the current crop of new releases from major studios is looking pretty good, right? So that's another side of the conversation that I think would be too disparaging to have right now, frankly.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, one thing that's helped this too, and I'll give it a little credit, is people always want something to hate. And at the time, when before this movie came out, it was Return of the Jedi. After this movie came out, it was this movie. And then after the sequels came out, it was the sequels. And now people are coming back around to this. So there's a little bit more there than just what we've discussed so far. But I honestly, unless you had anything else you wanted to bring up about the movie, I think this is a good time to look back at our final verdicts and see if we want to change or strengthen our opinion. So just so that everybody knows where we stood last time, before we dive back into this as well. Gabe went first last time and gave us a not that bad. Compared and contrasted the feeling of the movie with the experience in watching it. I gave us an actually great, which was the first time that had ever happened on our show when we covered this movie at the time of covering it. So, Gabe, I will jump to you here. You did go first last time. I'm gonna have you go first this time. Let the audience know, and me. I don't know how you're gonna come out of this. Have you changed in your final verdict of this movie since our last time watching it? And if so, what went into that?
I'm going to land on the same verdict as before, and I'll reinforce it by by saying this. I like this movie as an underdog, black sheep type of affair. I like its subversive nature, but I don't want to embrace it as a model or uh, as something to be emulated, right, or looked up to. It's like I said, it has many flaws, with a range of severity there, and I still haven't found quite my human connection. Although maybe on another rewatch and another rewatch, I can finally really cling on to Qui-Gon Jinn as my human connection. But for
Right.
right now, it's a fascinating movie. It's a curious movie. One with a lot of eye candy, and I
Yep.
was actually quite impressed at how the effects still hold up 25 years later. Uh, I'm not going to repeat the mistakes that the movie's made because we all know them, but I'm going to say that the the kind of obsession with trade routes and Senate machinations still brings a smile to my face, and it's certainly a movie that is due for a reappraisal, and I will reinforce the not that bad status by giving it a not that bad.
Very fair. Very fair. And when I'm looking at this again, the Phantom Menace. Um, First, I'm very happy to see it do so well on re-release. I mean, I think no matter how anybody feels about this movie, it's just cool to see something come back in theaters and not only do well, but like do well enough to be up there with actual releases of the time. It's a sad state of movies that we're in if that's the case, or movie going. But it's cool to see. Um, Last time I gave this an actually great, and what I wish I could do is I wish For right now, I wish I was Cody Leach so that I could use his unique ranking for our show and say this is actually fucking awesome. He is the only one to ever introduce a rating on our show, and I wish I could do it. It's for him and him only. Look, this movie has some issues. It has some things that stand out when I watch it, but almost none of them, especially the more that I watch this, I would think my issues would become more glaring and that I would have more problems with them. But I wouldn't even say more forgiving. They just don't bother me, or they don't even come into my head when I'm watching it. And that's something that I think I try to achieve with every movie that I watch. I want to enjoy everything I see, but there's just so much happiness that I have when I watch this movie. I mean, from start to finish, from opening title crawl, from the opening 20th Century Fox intro on the copy that I watch, all the way through to the end of the movie. I'm having a great time. I'm enjoying most of what I see. I'm enjoying the world building. I'm enjoying one of the coolest characters in the history of Star Wars and film, for that matter, in Darth Maul, as far as design is concerned.
Hmm.
Um, there's so much that I have to enjoy about this movie that it would be impossible for me to change my rating as far as this show is concerned. But I've actually upped the rating on my letterbox for this movie after this most recent viewing. Haven't put the review in yet, but I'm gonna up it, and I'm happy to do that. This is easily one of my favorite Star Wars movies. It is a top 5 Star Wars film in my mind, and one of I could honestly say this is on the list of however many favorite movies. This is one that I would be proud to say is on there.
That's not where I expected you to go. I thought you were gonna go lower. So it's a surprise, but a welcome one.
Yeah, I wanted to make it sound like I was going lower early in the episode, but no, I swerved you once again. Not really. I mean, like with Star Wars, that's the thing. I joked about not being impartial at the beginning of the episode, and I don't really want to be in a world where movie discussion is impartial. I mean, that's part of what we love about movies, right? Is how it makes us feel and how we feel about them. Um, I think that should factor into any opinion that you're talking about. So if people want to discredit me for that, go for it. But this movie fucking kicks ass.
Kicks ass. Okay, well, you heard
Yeah.
it here again. If you thought that we had come to our senses, I guess not. We are still,
Nope.
at least Connor is still banging the drum of the Phantom Menace after our first conversation about it. And maybe if we revisit this movie again for its 50th anniversary, if we're still doing this podcast,
25 years from now,
yeah,
dude, that would be awesome.
then we can really, our verdict will be it's actually greatest.
Greatest of all time.
It'll keep pushing boundaries.
We're gonna
But
create a new rating better than Empire.
let's go ahead and end this conversation
Yeah,
before that line of thinking can go any further.
one
Well,
hundred
guys,
percent. Yeah,
thank you for checking out our first revisited episode. We've
yeah,
been thinking about doing revisits for a while. It was a really great opportunity to do it
yeah.
while the Phantom Menace is all the rage with the kids at these days. So let us know how you enjoyed this, and we'll see if we can continue to revisit any of our old episodes for the future. Revisit our old episodes for the future. Yeah, makes sense. Nailed it.
Yeah,
Boom.
got it. Yeah,
Where
so
can
many
they
things.
support us, Connor?
Oh, they can support us they can support us in a couple of places. Of course, you can head on over if you're feeling super generous to our Patreon. Our Patreon is the step to do bigger and better things with Not That Bad. We're really happy to have one that people can give us money in. So if you feel inclined to go over and support the show financially, you can absolutely do so, and you will get some exciting perks. You'll have the opportunity to get a free sticker if you if you subscribe at a certain tier or higher. Of course, the biggest tier or the biggest reward, rather, in my mind, is the specials that we put on our Patreon. Sometimes it might be the first time you're seeing something that we're trying out for the first time. Sometimes you may be seeing an episode that may never see the light of day. We got stuff on there right now that nobody has ever seen other than our patrons, and you only get that when you sign up on our Patreon, lowest tier or higher. So definitely check that out if you feel so inclined. But if you don't want to give us money, there's plenty of other ways to support the show. Like, comment, subscribe, share our episodes, whether it's on audio or video platforms. And if you want to support us on social media by following and liking as well, you can absolutely do so with an easy and convenient way to get to all of those. NotThatBadPod.com. Links to websites, socials, bios about your two favorite terrible take artists in Gabe and I, even a description of how this show came to be. So many things on the website and more to come. So check it out if you'd like to support us. But for now, we're done whoring ourselves out once again. And Gabe, would you like to take us out?
I would love to do nothing more. All right, everybody. May the force be with you. And if you're Catholic, then also with you. This is Gabe.
Misa Connor.
And this is Not That Bad, saying, why did we do this again? Okay, no, this is Not That Bad signing out.